My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 32 years old. On October 18, 2024, at exactly 8:47 p.m., I stood beneath a crystal chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Harper Regency Hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina, holding a champagne flute I hadn't taken a single sip from all evening. More than 300 guests filled the ballroom. The investors smiled for the cameras. Employees stood shoulder to shoulder near the stage. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Then my boss adjusted the microphone and looked directly at me. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard Calloway said with a practiced smile, "great companies succeed because they never allow emotion to interfere with leadership." The room fell silent. He continued. "Some employees mistake loyalty for value. Tonight I'd like our investors to see that I make difficult decisions without hesitation." He paused just long enough for every camera to point toward me. "Security," he said. "Please escort Olivia Carter out of this ballroom. Effective immediately." He smiled. "You're fired." A few nervous laughs drifted through the crowd. Someone whispered behind me. "She never saw that coming." Richard folded his hands confidently. "This company rewards excellence, not comfort." Applause echoed through the ballroom. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask for another chance. I simply placed my untouched champagne flute onto a server's silver tray, straightened the sleeve of my midnight blue evening gown, and glanced at my watch. 8:49 p.m. I had waited 4 years for that exact moment. Because what nobody inside that ballroom knew was that I wasn't simply another senior employee. I was the company's largest silent shareholder. The woman Richard had just humiliated in front of every investor was the same woman whose family trust had quietly kept his company alive when its bank accounts were nearly empty. He thought he had embarrassed me. He had no idea he had just destroyed himself. Before I tell you how one public humiliation turned into the most expensive mistake Richard Calloway ever made, please take a second to like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing where you're listening from around the world. 5 years earlier. On April 15, 2019, my alarm rang at exactly 5:32 a.m. The little house on 818 Cherry Bend Road smelled exactly the way it had every morning since I was a child. Fresh coffee, warm toast, and cedar wood. My grandfather, William Carter, believed cedar kept closets honest. He also believed people were easier to understand than they pretended to be. I lived with him after finishing graduate school. Most people assumed we struggled financially because Grandpa still drove an old pickup truck with faded paint and refused to replace furniture that worked perfectly well. They were wrong. Grandpa believed wealth should create freedom, not attention. "Anyone can spend money," he often said while buttering his toast. "It takes discipline to ignore applause." At 27, I thought those were just old-fashioned sayings. Years later, they became the reason I survived. A month after graduation, I accepted a position as a senior systems architect at North Axis Analytics, a rapidly growing logistics software company in downtown Charlotte. My starting salary was $92,000 a year. It was more money than I had ever imagined earning. On my first morning, the office occupied only 2 floors inside an old brick warehouse. Paint peeled from the freight elevator. The coffee machine made terrible coffee. Half the conference room chairs didn't match. Nobody cared. Everyone believed they were building something extraordinary. Including me. Around 9:13 a.m., Richard Calloway walked across the office floor wearing an expensive charcoal suit and an even more expensive smile. He shook my hand firmly. "Welcome to North Axis, Olivia." "Thank you. We don't build software here." I looked at him curiously. "We build the future." Everyone nearby laughed. So did I. That was my first mistake. For nearly a year, Richard appeared to be everything people wanted in a CEO. He remembered birthdays. He bought breakfast every Friday. He congratulated employees publicly. He talked about teamwork. He spoke confidently during investor meetings. People admired him, including me, until they started disappearing. Not physically, professionally. Whenever a project succeeded, Richard stood in front of reporters and accepted every compliment himself. Whenever a project failed, someone else quietly lost their job. The pattern became impossible to ignore. I remember January 22, 2020, during a Monday operations meeting. Melissa Grant, our 31-year-old project manager, had just completed the company's largest software migration. The client renewed their contract for an additional $218,400. Everyone knew Melissa deserved recognition. Richard smiled at the executive team. This success happened because leadership refused to lower standards. He accepted the applause. Melissa sat beside me. She smiled politely. But beneath the conference table, she twisted the silver ring on her finger until her knuckles turned white. Afterward, we walked together toward the parking garage. "It doesn't bother you?" I asked. She shrugged. "It should. It used to." She looked toward the elevator doors before quietly adding, "You'll understand eventually." 3 months later, she resigned. Nobody mentioned her name again. That frightened me more than her resignation. North Axis kept growing. Employees kept leaving. Richard kept smiling. By the summer of 2021, the company employed nearly 100 people. Marble replaced the old reception desk. Glass walls replaced ordinary offices. Professional photographers began following Richard during corporate events. Every magazine article featured his face. Never the engineers. Never customer support. Never the software teams working through weekends. One afternoon, I overheard Richard speaking with Lauren Pierce, the marketing director. "Investors don't buy businesses," Richard said. "They buy confidence." Lauren laughed. "What if the confidence isn't real?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Then make it look real until nobody asks questions." They never noticed I had walked past the conference room. I drove home in complete silence that evening. Grandpa was sitting on the porch watching rain collect in the gutters. Without turning around, he asked, "Still think your boss is different?" I sat beside him. For almost a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, I admitted, "I think he's performing more than he's leading." Grandpa nodded slowly. The performance always becomes louder before the truth arrives. I didn't understand what he meant. Not completely. Because inside the locked drawer of his old oak desk rested an ordinary brown envelope. It looked worthless. Inside it was a secret that would one day change my life and end Richard Calloway's career forever. The next morning, before leaving for work, I found Grandpa standing in front of that same oak desk. The drawer was open. The brown envelope rested in his hands. He looked at it for a long moment before sliding it back inside. "You've noticed it before, haven't you?" he asked. I nodded. I always wondered what was inside. He smiled faintly. "Curiosity is healthy." He locked the drawer. "But timing is wiser." I laughed. "So, when do I get to know?" His expression turned serious. "When someone mistakes your silence for weakness." That answer stayed with me for years. Life moved forward. North Axis expanded faster than anyone expected. By February 9, 2022, we had moved into a modern 12-story office building on East Trade Street. The company employed more than 180 people. Richard loved the new headquarters. Italian marble filled the lobby. A giant digital screen displayed company achievements. Fresh flowers appeared every Monday morning. Every visitor left impressed. That was exactly what Richard wanted. He believed appearances created success. I believed success created appearances. We never argued about it. We simply lived by different philosophies. One Tuesday afternoon, Richard asked me to stop by his office. His corner office overlooked downtown Charlotte through floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything inside looked expensive. A walnut desk. Designer furniture. Awards lined every shelf. Most of them featured Richard's name. Very few mentioned the people who had actually earned them. He motioned for me to sit. "Olivia," he said, "our investors trust you. I appreciate that. They see you as dependable. I try to be." He leaned forward. "But don't mistake being respected for being indispensable." The sentence lingered between us. I simply nodded. "I won't." He smiled as though he had just established dominance. I quietly left his office. That evening, I drove straight to Grandpa's house. His health had declined over the previous year. Congestive heart failure had slowed him down, but it hadn't changed who he was. He still insisted on watering his own garden. Still refused help carrying groceries. Still drank coffee from the same chipped ceramic mug every morning. As we sat on the porch, he looked toward the sunset. "You know why arrogant people fear quiet people?" I shook my head. "They can't predict them." He took another sip. "Loud people spend their lives protecting an image." He looked directly at me. "Quiet people protect the truth." Those words became the last lesson he ever taught me. 3 months later. On May 27, 2022, Grandpa passed away peacefully at 6:18 a.m. He was 77 years old. The funeral was simple. 45 people attended. No extravagant flowers. No dramatic speeches. Just family, neighbors, and a handful of old friends whose hands still carried decades of honest work. After everyone left the cemetery, attorney Helen Mercer, 58 years old, approached me. She had represented Grandpa for nearly 25 years. She handed me a small brass key. "He wanted you to have this." "The desk?" She nodded. "And the envelope." That evening I unlocked Grandpa's desk. The brown envelope lay exactly where he had left it. Inside were stock certificates, corporate filings, trust agreements, and one handwritten letter. I recognized Grandpa's handwriting immediately. "Olivia, if you're reading this, someone has finally mistaken your patience for permission. Years ago, I invested in a small software company because I believed in the people building it, not the executives running it. I never wanted recognition. I transferred everything into the Carter Family Trust because character survives longer than applause. Don't reveal the truth unless honesty demands it. Remember, ownership never needs an introduction. Love. Grandpa." I sat alone at the dining table until almost midnight. The numbers barely seemed real. Years before North Axis became successful, Grandpa had quietly invested $63,500 during its earliest funding round. As the company expanded through mergers and private investment, that ownership grew into just over 18% of all voting shares. The Carter Family Trust had automatically transferred voting authority to me after Grandpa's death. Legally, I wasn't simply a senior employee. I was North Axis's largest individual shareholder. And almost no one knew. Richard certainly didn't. To him, the Carter Family Trust was just another institutional investor listed on quarterly reports. He never questioned who stood behind it. Because Richard believed powerful people always introduce themselves. Grandpa never did. Neither would I. The following morning, I called Helen Mercer. Should I tell the board? No. Why not? She opened another folder. Because your grandfather expected you to ask. She unfolded one final note. If leadership remains honorable, she read, remain invisible. If leadership becomes arrogant, let arrogance expose itself first. I closed my eyes. Richard had already begun doing exactly that. For the next 2 years, I attended meetings like every other executive. I voted through Helen by proxy as trustee. No one connected Olivia Carter to the Carter Family Trust. Least of all Richard. Meanwhile, his obsession with appearances became impossible to ignore. The employee wellness program quietly disappeared. Bonuses shrank. Training budgets were reduced. Yet Richard approved nearly $420,000 for an extravagant investor appreciation gala. One afternoon, Olivia Chen, our finance director, knocked gently on my office door. She looked exhausted. They canceled employee development funding. But the gala budget survived? She nodded. Every penny. I leaned back in my chair. So image matters more than people. She sighed. That's becoming our company culture. Those words stayed with me. Image. Not integrity. Image. Not leadership. Weeks later, an email marked confidential arrived in my inbox. Subject: Investor Appreciation Gala, executive attendance required. Black tie. Media coverage. National investors. Television interviews. Mandatory attendance. The event would take place on October 18, 2024. The same night that would change everything. I almost declined the invitation. Then my phone rang. It was Helen. I've reviewed tomorrow's board agenda. Anything important? A new governance proposal. I frowned. What kind of proposal? Richard wants emergency executive authority. What does that mean? If approved, shareholder oversight would be significantly reduced during future investment rounds. He never discussed that. He wasn't planning to. Silence filled the call. Finally, Helen spoke again. Olivia. Yes. I believe tomorrow is the day your grandfather prepared you for. I looked toward the fireproof safe in my home office. Inside rested Grandpa's brown envelope. For the first time in 2 years, I removed every document and carefully placed them inside a black leather portfolio. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing to protect the truth. If you've ever watched someone else take credit for your hard work, or seen confidence rewarded while integrity was ignored, type "still standing" in the comments. I want to know we're not alone. At exactly 7:06 p.m. the following evening, I parked across from the Harper Regency Hotel. Luxury cars filled the entrance. Camera flashes lit up the sidewalk. I picked up the black leather portfolio from the passenger seat. Inside rested a lifetime of Grandpa's wisdom. And the documents that could end Richard Calloway's career. I locked the car, walked toward the ballroom entrance. Never imagining that within the next 2 hours, Richard would publicly fire the woman who legally had the power to remove him as CEO. The ballroom looked even grander from the inside. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the stage while servers moved between tables carrying silver trays filled with champagne. Television cameras lined the back wall, waiting for Richard's keynote speech. The giant LED screen behind the podium displayed the company's slogan. Building the future with vision. Richard loved slogans. Especially when they described someone else's work. I glanced at my watch. 8:31 p.m. My black leather portfolio rested quietly beside my chair. Inside were the documents Grandpa had protected for nearly a decade. Across the room, Richard laughed while shaking hands with Martin Ellison, 59, managing partner of Redwood Capital. His investment firm was considering a $42 million investment into North Axis. Tonight wasn't just another company gala. It was Richard's biggest performance. At exactly 8:44 p.m., he walked confidently onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we celebrate another successful year, leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions." The ballroom became silent. Then my photograph appeared on the enormous screen behind him. Employees slowly turned toward me. Richard smiled. "Olivia Carter has become resistant to our company's direction." He paused deliberately. "I want our investors to understand something tonight." He looked directly into my eyes. "No employee is bigger than this company." A few uneasy laughs echoed through the ballroom. Then came the sentence he would spend years wishing he had never spoken. "People like Olivia build reports." He smiled proudly. "Leaders like me build history." Scattered applause filled the room. He raised one hand toward the security staff. "And effective immediately." Another smile. "You're fired." Two security officers began walking toward my table. I remained seated. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even look at Richard. Instead, I calmly placed my untouched champagne flute onto a passing server's tray. Then I stood. Smoothed the front of my midnight blue evening gown. Buttoned my tailored blazer. And quietly waited. One of the security officers, Michael Reeves, 43 years old, stopped in front of me. His voice was respectful. "Ma'am, would you like me to escort you outside?" I smiled gently. "No." I reached inside my portfolio. Not for revenge. For the truth. Helen. Attorney Helen Mercer stood from the front row table. Until that moment, Richard believed she represented an outside investor. Instead, she walked confidently toward the stage carrying another folder. Richard frowned. "I'm sorry, Helen, this isn't the appropriate time." She didn't stop walking. Actually, she faced the chairman of the board. "Mr. Chairman, before anyone removes Ms. Carter, I request that item 7 on tonight's agenda be addressed." Richard's smile disappeared. "We're not discussing governance tonight." Helen remained calm. "The bylaws require shareholder motions to take precedence over executive announcements." Board Chairman Walter Simmons, 68 years old, adjusted his glasses. He looked toward Board Secretary Daniel Foster. "Is she correct?" Daniel opened the corporate handbook. He reviewed the relevant section. After several moments he nodded. "She is." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Helen placed the leather portfolio onto the podium. "I'd like these ownership documents entered into tonight's record." Richard laughed nervously. "This is hardly the time for paperwork." Nobody answered him. Walter slowly opened the folder. His expression changed after reading only the first page. He turned another. Then another. Silence spread across the ballroom. Even the musicians stopped playing. Finally Walter looked up. "Richard." "What?" "Did you know the Carter Family Trust owns just over 18% of North Axis?" Richard shrugged. "Of course. It's an institutional investor." Walter slowly shook his head. "No." He looked toward me. "The managing beneficiary is Olivia Carter." For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard stared at me. His confidence disappeared. "That's impossible." Helen slid one final document across the podium. The probate transfer became legally effective on May 27, 2022. Daniel carefully compared every signature. They're authentic. Richard looked around the ballroom as though waiting for someone to correct the mistake. Nobody did. Martin Ellison slowly stood. I was never informed that your company's largest individual shareholder had been excluded from executive decisions. Richard struggled to answer. We didn't know. Martin interrupted. You didn't ask. Olivia Chin quietly stood beside her table. He never asked about any of us. Carlos Medina stood next. Olivia built the infrastructure that impressed every investor sitting in this room. Lauren Pierce slowly rose. I've watched Richard accept credit for other people's work for 4 years. Another department manager stood. Then another. One by one. Employees found their voices. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. They simply told the truth. Richard turned toward me. You planned this. I calmly answered. No. You wanted this. No. Then what is happening? I looked directly at him. This is what happens when the truth arrives after the applause. His face reddened. You pretended to be an ordinary employee. I was an employee. You deceived everyone. I shook my head. I never lied. He searched desperately for another argument. None came. Walter Simmons cleared his throat. As chairman, I move for an immediate vote regarding executive confidence. Martin Ellison spoke first. Redwood Capital supports the motion. So do I, another director said. So do I. So do I. Every vote came calmly. Professionally. Unanimously. Walter folded his hands. The motion carries. He looked directly at Richard. Your authority as Chief Executive Officer is terminated effective immediately. Richard stood frozen. This company belongs to me. For the first time that evening. I smiled. No. It never did. You only borrowed the microphone. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. The silence was louder than any standing ovation. Michael Reeves approached Richard once again. His tone remained respectful. Sir. I'll need you to come with me. Richard looked around the ballroom. He searched every familiar face. Not one person defended him. Without another word, he walked toward the exit. The ballroom doors closed quietly behind him. That soft click echoed louder than all the applause he had ever chased. The following weeks changed North Axis forever. The board appointed an interim CEO while an independent audit reviewed executive conduct. Investigators uncovered manipulated performance reports, misleading investor presentations, and repeated cases where employees' achievements had been credited to Richard. Although no criminal charges were filed, he violated multiple executive agreements and fiduciary obligations. His separation package was cancelled. His executive stock options were revoked. Redwood Capital completed its investment only after sweeping governance reforms were approved. The company's first major decision wasn't about profits. It was about people. Employee bonuses were restored. Training programs returned. Department leaders finally received public recognition. Melissa Grant accepted an executive consulting position. Carlos Medina became Chief Technology Officer. Olivia Chin was promoted to Chief Financial Officer. The board asked me to become CEO. I politely declined. Instead, I accepted a seat on the board of directors. That felt right. Leadership had never been about standing on the stage. It had always been about protecting the people building it. Today I still live just outside Charlotte. My home is modest. Quiet. Peaceful. Every morning I drink coffee from Grandpa William Carter's old ceramic mug. The cedar smell disappeared years ago. His lessons never did. People often ask why I never revealed my ownership sooner. The answer is simple. I wanted to know how people treated someone they believed had no power. That's when character becomes impossible to fake. Power doesn't create character. It exposes it. Applause doesn't build leaders. Integrity does. Several months after the gala, Michael Reeves mailed me a handwritten note. Inside were only 12 words. Thank you for proving dignity never has to raise its voice to win. I folded the letter carefully. Then I placed it inside Grandpa's old brown envelope. It belonged there. Sometimes I still think about 8:49 p.m. The moment I quietly placed my untouched champagne flute onto a silver tray. Everyone believed I had just lost everything. The truth was, that was the exact moment I finally stopped pretending I owned nothing. The next morning, I wrapped both hands around Grandpa's coffee mug, looked out across the sunrise, smiled quietly, and knew I had honored every lesson he ever taught me. I did it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or judged before anyone knew your worth, share this video. Someone in your life might need to hear it. And subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this.